to begin our session. Bishop Joel Konzen was ordained a priest in the Society of Mary in 1979. He has a Bachelor's of Arts in English from St. Meinrad Seminary, a Master of Divinity from Notre Dame Seminary in New Orleans, and both a master's degree in systemic theology and a Master's of Arts in Educational Administration from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. Many of you will know Bishop Konzen from his many years serving at Marist School in Atlanta as a teacher, admissions director, principal, and president. He's also been a parish priest, the principal and president at St. Michael's Academy in Austin, Texas, and the vicar provincial of the former Washington province of the Society of Mary. Bishop Konzen assisted in the founding of 2 new Catholic schools here in Atlanta, Notre Dame Academy and Cristo Rey Atlanta Jesuit High School. He currently serves on the boards of Marist School, Pope Francis Children's Home and School in Ghana, and Notre Dame Seminary in New Orleans. Bishop Konzen was ordained as auxiliary bishop of the Archdiocese of Atlanta in April 2018, and his episcopal motto is "Be merciful and with a cheerful heart." Thank you, Bishop Konzen, for agreeing to lead us in prayer to begin this investment forum.
Thank you, Nancy, for that generous introduction, which is longer than my prayer, but I'm glad to be here, glad to be with all of you. On behalf of Archbishop Hartmeyer, who can't be here today, I just want to say thank you to Nancy, to all of the champions of the Catholic Foundation of North Georgia. That's staff and volunteers and board, everybody really who cares about the foundation, which has had a tremendous first 30 years, and we certainly believe it has the promise of much the same and more in the years to come. So I want to say thank you also to today's guests. I'm sorry I won't be able to stay for the presentation by Mr. Temple, but I thank him too for being with us today. So let us pray. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. God of mercy, we ask for your help in this season of Lent, so that our hopes of living more according to your word and your will might be realized. Guide us by your Holy Spirit in honestly reckoning our shortcomings and knowing how we might expend our energy for the sake of Jesus Christ and his church. May we cooperate with your grace in ministering to others and thereby building a kingdom of justice and compassion. Bless us and those who are dear to us, and remind us in whatever way we may need to be grateful for the blessings we have received. In Christ our Lord, amen. Mary, help of Christians, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen.
Good morning. Get my... It's always nice to follow a fellow Toledoan. I knew both the bishop and I are from Toledo, Ohio. Right, we cheer for the Mud Hens, exactly. Good morning. My name is Matthew Grease. I am the current chair of the board of the Catholic Foundation of North Georgia. This morning I am here just briefly to express our gratitude to each of you for being here with us this morning, and in a special way, I want to say thank you to any of you who are new to these forums or to our organization. We are especially glad that you have joined us this morning. We have a great slate of speakers, and our ulterior motive, of course, is always to introduce you to us, to our organization, and to our mission. Our mission is basically to make sure that organizations in the Archdiocese are on sound financial grounds now and into the future. And because we have an excellent staff, many of whom are here today, or maybe everybody's here today, we're doing an absolutely amazing job at that. Nancy just mentioned that we are celebrating our 30th anniversary this year, which is hard to believe because, yeah. And it's really awesome to reflect on all the blessings that we have experienced from God, but working through the members of the Catholic community here in North Georgia. 30 years ago, we started with a $500,000 challenge grant, and now we have over 112, is that right? $112 million under stewardship. And we have, in that same period, we have given away $27 million in grants. I mean, how awesome is that, really? All I can say is, God is great, and God is indeed here with us. Father Henry, who I don't think is here, Father Henry Atom, who many of you likely know, is a member of our board, and he's the head of our Pastors Advisory Council. And in our meetings, he sometimes uses some churches in Boston as a great example of the importance of Catholics planning for the future. In Boston, there are some beautiful historic Catholic churches that remain open as places where you can worship, despite the fact that they have experienced, like many churches in the north and the inner cities, declining membership. And the reason that they can stay open as beacons of light in their community is because Catholics of old thought to leave money in gifts and endowment funds for their future. Meanwhile, in places like Ohio, where I'm from, New York, Pennsylvania, etc., many churches have been shuttered because they cannot afford to stay open. In fact, if you've ever visited, I don't know how many people have visited Mary Our Queen in Peachtree Corners, which is my church, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. We were able to repurpose the stained glass windows, the tabernacle, all the pews, statues, etc., from a church in Buffalo, New York, St. Gerard's, that had to close. And I invite you to visit. It's beautiful. But don't get me wrong. I mean, we're very appreciative and very happy that we have all those things and that we can use them in a sacred way. But it sure would have been nice if St. Gerard's could have stayed open. Instead, it had to be sold, and it's now a mosque, in fact. But meanwhile, in Boston, those wonderful, beautiful churches remain open. And why? It's because of forward-thinking, generous people. And you, my friends, and maybe your clients, can be those forward-thinking, generous people for our archdiocese. It's so very, very important to the future. I was just talking, I don't remember to whom, but I am the father of 3 children, all of whom are in their 20s now. And this year has been an exciting and honestly very hectic one for us. My daughter Sarah got married back in September at Mary Our Queen, gorgeous, beautiful wedding. And my oldest son Benjamin is getting married this summer in Chicago, also in a Catholic church. And my wife and I are just overjoyed that both of our children, we don't know about the third one yet, but we'll get to him later. But what a blessing it is that they chose to be married in the Catholic Church, right? I mean, especially these days. And then God willing, in the next few years, I guess my wife and I will become grandparents, which is, hard to believe because I feel like I'm 18 years old inside. But that, that gets me thinking. It gets me thinking about the future, about our world, about the future of the church, what it will look for those grandchildren, what will look like for their children and their grandchildren. And that, my friends, is why I really, really enjoy being involved with the Catholic Foundation and why I have been involved with it for about 15 years now, about half of its existence. I just couldn't wish for a better organization to be part of. We have an excellent board, exceptional staff. Everybody works diligently to support our parishes, our schools, our nonprofits, both today and in the future. We have a wonderful investment committee and investment advisors, two of whom you're going to hear from this morning. They carefully manage our assets. We always get clean audits by our CPAs. We have a staff that works super, super hard to make sure that donors' needs and intent are met. And the bottom line is that we do things right. And for that, I have been incredibly thankful to be part of it. And so are the parishes that receive our grants, the schools that receive scholarship funds, the nonprofits that receive money to help the poor, women experiencing unexpected pregnancies, veterans, immigrants, and others in need. And we've also found that our donors are quite grateful when we work with them to help determine the best way to leave their own Catholic legacies for whatever they care most about. And I hope that any of you who are interested in doing that, or who have clients who might be interested in doing that, will talk with us about it, because we can certainly make it happen, and it'll make you feel great to do it. Again, that's it. I just thank you for being here. I wish you all of God's blessings. And with that said, I will now turn to introducing our first speakers. As I mentioned earlier, we have incredible investment advisors, and you're going to hear from two of them, Rod Hennek and Michael Butkus, both of whom are partners at the Atlanta Consulting Group, which works with us, the Catholic Foundation, to make sure our investments are sound and properly diversified. They reminded me that the main thing I needed to mention was what parish they went to, which I will get to. But Rod is the founding partner at the Atlanta Consulting Group, and he's been working in the investment world for about 35 years. I'm sorry, I didn't want to age you, but that's a long time. He worked at Merrill Lynch and Morgan Keegan before establishing his own firm in 1985, which, by the way, I looked up, was the year that Madonna and Wham were at the top of the charts. Which I remember fondly. But take it from me, he really knows what he's doing. He's a fellow Catholic. He and his wife worship at the Catholic Church of St. Anne, and they are blessed with 3 children and 7 grandchildren. And Michael is Rod's partner at the Atlanta Consulting Group, where he has been for about a decade now. He provides investment advice to a wide range of clients, including endowments, foundations, family offices, religious entities, organizations like us. Michael is a parishioner of the cathedral, and he and his wife are blessed with 3 lovely daughters. And Michael and Rod, the stage is all yours.
Okay, so we got the old jokes out of the way. Good to see everybody here this morning. We're really happy to be here again to do our part in talking about investing through a Catholic lens. I'm going to do a quick profile of the firm, turning over to Michael to do the heavy lifting, and then I'll kind of finalize giving you the kind of a snapshot of the 3 portfolios we manage and how they've been, and candidly acknowledge where 2022 was a difficult year. We've started off a little bit better this year, so we'll go through that in some detail with you. I did want to recognize there are a lot of old friends. I say that since Matt said I started 35 years ago. Yes, I had hair back then, but there's a number of constituents and good-time friends that are in the audience that I've known over those years. And then I happen to walk in, and I see the old coach from St. Pius and Blessed Trinity that knew my 3 children in high school. And then all of a sudden, I told him I have 7 grandchildren, so it was great to see Coach Turner and his wife attending today as well. And yes, the check's on the way, Ricky. All right. As Matt said, we've had the wonderful opportunity of working with the Catholic Foundation of North Georgia for a long time. In that time, we've had the wonderful opportunity to help them achieve their mission, and we'll talk about that in a second. As we talked about, the firm was formulated, if I can get my notes now, in 1985. We started as part of a firm called Morgan Keegan, and then went to Raymond James, and as Matt said, we went out on our own. I've always been a self-sustained division of the firms that we worked with. Over those 35 years, we had the wonderful opportunity to have assets under management with wonderful clients of about 100 different relationships with over $15 billion. It's just like Warren Buffett. If you make a good investment a long time ago, it grows over time if you're fortunate to have that. The average tenure of our clients has been over 14 years, so we're graced to have that confidence and the trust that those people have placed in us over those years. We are a 100% owned firm. Proud to say we added 2 new partners, of which my associate Michael joined us last year as one of the partners. And we're really focused on achieving the best interest of our clients. And we've continued this successful transition of ownership by passing it on to partners to make sure that we can continue the culture that has been so important in building the Atlanta Consulting Group over those 35 years. The team is really deep. We really believe in having inside our organization people that we can go across the desk and talk to. So we have an in-house performance team. We've had an in-house investment analyst team. And I think the other thing, and Michael is a good example of that, we've promoted from within. Michael came to us with a lot of experience as an investment analyst. We made a senior investment analyst. Then he became a consultant, and then he became my right-hand guy to help transition my business as I try to improve my golf game, which will be absolutely impossible. Our clients are very diverse. And we have clients in over 23 of the 50 states. Go out to California, we actually have clients in Europe. But you'll notice that almost 49% are in the endowment and foundation and religious area. We can tell you many stories of certain Catholic nuns that introduced us, and then we have a certain nun in Philadelphia, Sister Joan Gibbons, that whenever she went on to another board, we just went with her. And then years ago when she was celebrating her Jubilee, she suggested in my retirement, Rod, you should hire me as a consultant. But I will tell you, she's a really tough negotiator. So it's that trust and an experience we've had from clients that have allowed us to build these long-term relationships. The median relationship we have with a client is around $60 million, but the average is over $135 million. We're really blessed to work with other Catholic entities and have to date over $3 billion of Catholic value investing with our clients, and that continues. Names you would remember like the Xavier, both in Cincinnati, Xavier University, also Xavier in Louisiana, which was started by Sister Catherine Drexel many years ago. So that's kind of our heritage. And then finally, the other thing that we're really pleased about is 65% of our clients are not-for-profit. So we understand this world and how important it is for us to achieve the missions of those institutions. The last thing, and I know I went out of order for you, is our mission statement. And I should say our mission statement is to accomplish the mission statement of our clients. And that, in this case, is to ensure that we have the financial resources to serve and make a difference in the lives of the current and future generations within our communities. We try to form long-term relationships with our clients to do what's in their best interest to achieve those mission statements. That's our sole purpose, and we think we've done a great job in partnering with those kind of institutions to achieve that. And that's our bottom line. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael to do all the heavy lifting about how do we infuse the Catholic values that are so important to us into our portfolios for our clients.
Thank you, Rod. I'm actually talking on this subject matter 3 times this week, but this is the only time that I have to do it in front of both the bishop and my mother. So forgive me if I'm a little more nervous. Nancy and I came up with this witty title, Investing Through a Catholic Lens, probably 5 months ago. And so over the last few months, I've been trying to think of what does that actually mean. And so about a month ago, I went to the eye doctor and it started thinking through that. So there's going to be some analogies made if you've ever done that or have done that recently. But before we jump into specifically what the Catholic lens is, I want to start out on this page because, for some of you that have never gone through this, you may say, well, what's the difference between traditional investing and Catholic investing? What's the difference between traditional investing, Catholic investing, and philanthropy? So if you start on this page on the far left here, traditional investing is what most people in this room have done. From the retirement assets, right? And so you put money away in your IRA or your 401k, and you don't really think about it from a social perspective. You just want to earn enough money to hopefully retire when you'd like to. On the far right part of the page, there's philanthropy. That is something like the Archbishop's annual appeal. You're welcome, Bishop. And so there, you don't do that with anything in terms of financial returns. You're just giving those assets away for social or environmental reasons. And then there's this whole middle section. And so what you can see here is when you start on the far left and you go into the responsible investing section, this is where Catholic investing typically started. So this is the negative screens, right? Don't buy the sin stocks, tobacco, alcohol, weapons, gambling, pornography, nuclear energy. But we've sort of seen, and if you were here last year, you heard me speak about sort of the transition we've seen into the more sustainable side of things, where we're starting to consider carbon footprint, resource use, compensation, gender equality. The way we typically think about it here at the Catholic Foundation is we spend most of our time in the responsible and sustainable investing. I think we're moving towards a world where some of that thematic impact investing may come into play, in particular with climate change. But at the end of the day, a lot of that impact is the use of these dollars. So we think about what's the best way to grow these dollars such that you can then donate them to have an impact on your community, however you choose to do so, be it schools or not-for-profits that you're interested in. We continue to see the spectrum of this world change, and before anyone asks the questions, our government gave us this great cartoon, which is way more relevant today than it was a few days ago, as the U.S. Senate is working to overturn some legislation in regards to ESG. But it does show you that it's not a perfect science. And most of the things we've done in the Catholic Church, if there were a question, you could pretty quickly go get your catechism, ask your priests, and they'd have a pretty direct answer. But when it comes to investing, this is probably the best way to think about it, because sometimes the more social aspects of things don't align with what you would traditionally think about in the Catholic Church in regards to climate change. Certainly we have alignment in regards to life, but at the end of the day, we're following that guy on the far right. So the next question I typically get is, wow, it's really hard to invest as a Catholic because you're always going to underperform. If you have a social restriction, you can't beat the index. It is a challenge, but what I have here is empirical data that shows you this is the State Street Catholic screened S&P 500 strategy going back to June of 2000. And what it shows you is it does not always outperform. If you can find something that always outperforms, let us know. We'll add it to the portfolio. But what this shows you is that there are periods of time where we are sacrificing returns, and you can see those red areas. But a majority of the time, over multiple market cycles, that little orange line shows you that net of fees, this has slightly outperformed the S&P 500 over that entire period. So a year ago, when we came in here, we showed you the S&P 500, and we were beating, and it was great. You can see that being overweight some positions in technology, consumer, and communication services hurt us last year. But we're willing to accept that underperformance because we were investing with those Catholic values. Actually, let me go back. So the question may be for this S&P strategy, just to give you some statistics, approximately 53 stocks are screened out here, and 16% of the index. And so when you rebalance the index, it makes you overweight certain stocks when you wouldn't have been overweight. And so that's what leads to some of the differences in performance. And if someone wants to get into the weeds with that, I'll be available after my presentation. So getting back to my eye doctor analogy, when I look at this slide, and yes, it's very busy, I picture your annual enrollment in Aetna, or we may have some Medicare folks in the room, and you have to decide what you're going to do. And so when we build the framework for our socially responsible policy, it's not as simple necessarily as saying it's just Catholic and you walk away, right? We work with a number of Catholic institutions, and every single one of them does things differently. And so when we work with the Catholic Foundation, what we've done is start at the top and say, okay, what are our guidelines? How are we going to view this? And I'll show you where we get at the end of the day. Does this reflect our organization's beliefs? And no, not all Catholics have the same beliefs. There are some nuns that I've gotten together with that they said, well, we don't want to own any gun manufacturers. Well, very quickly, one of the most vertically challenged nuns I've ever met stood up from Macon, Georgia, and she said, I'm pro-gun. And I watched two nuns get in an argument about whether they were going to have guns in their portfolio. And so it's not always a reflection of just the church. There's a lot of room for debate, and that continues to evolve. A year ago when I came into this room, I talked to you about the evolution of the USCCB letter, which hadn't been touched for almost 20 years, and they revised that. The good news is they've taken a look and they're modernizing that. The bad news is it's not as concrete as it used to be. It's not just don't own these things. It uses the word engage. It takes into account the environment, and so that leaves some gray area for us to decide how we want to go about those areas. A lot of education. In particular, one area we've struggled with, to be honest with you, is fossil fuel-free investing, right? The definition of that is also very wide, because very quickly as Catholics, typically we'd say, we'll just screen them out. We won't own Exxon. Well, guess who's made the most commitment to climate change? Probably Exxon and some of these large energy companies. Amazon is climate neutral. Why? Because you could probably look outside and there'll be a blue truck driving around, and they don't own that truck, right? And it's certainly not running on electricity. Maybe they will be one day. So then after we go through that process, we have to incorporate these beliefs and this education and go select managers. And so we have to look at, is it a mutual fund? Is it a separate account? Is it 100% screened? Is it not screened at all, but it falls into our categories? And I'll show you some of the analysis we do later. And then on an ongoing basis, we monitor for compliance. And so we have to sit down as a committee, and we've got a very engaged group of people that debate that, and sometimes we have differing opinions on the committee as well, which is a good thing. And then we're always looking for new strategies. ESG, as I mentioned, has become a hot topic, right? And ESG is not necessarily equivalent to socially responsible Catholic investing, but it does provide more opportunities for us as Catholics to look at other strategies. Now, the big question has been, are they asset gathering and using a hot dot name to just go gather assets and try and put them in folks' portfolio, or are they really doing what they say they're doing? Sorry for all the words, but this is, for any lawyers out there, this is our policy. But I want to make the point here at the top where there's a belief that this is a competing duty, right? Where when you look at the USCCB letter, there are two principles. And it's not either or in our belief, it's and. And so our first principle is to exercise responsible financial stewardship. These assets are given to the Catholic Foundation to grow and hopefully grow in a Catholic manner to support Catholic organizations. But if we were 100% invested in a Catholic manner and went down a lot of these social rabbit holes and didn't make any money for you to donate, I don't think anyone would be very happy. So we marry the two in terms of thinking about that financial stewardship, but then also exercising the ethical and social stewardship. And that's very common. We have Catholic priests where we manage their pension, and they're certainly concerned about return there. They are very concerned about the social aspect of things, but we need to earn a certain return to make sure that they can retire and their healthcare needs will be taken care of. And so what we do there in that fourth bullet point is every year, and it happens way more than just annually, the foundation is dedicated to comply to the greatest extent deemed possible with the USCCB letter. And when possible, they intend to utilize funds that generally comply with the investment guidelines as stated by the USCCB. So what's that mean? That means that we're not always going to have the perfect Catholic fund, but we're going to know what we own, we're going to understand if they violate, and then we're going to get into the weeds to see if it's a true violation. So this, you may recognize this. I'm sure everyone memorized it when I talked about it last year. But if you go from top to bottom here, these are some of the main guidelines within the USCCB letter. And so protecting human life, I think we could all get on the same page with that in this room as Catholics. And there have been some updates there. But what I want to point out is if you go from top to bottom here, protecting human life, no questions, very easy to screen. Are you producing an abortifacient? How much of that is your percentage of revenue? But as you go down, promoting human dignity, I think we'd all agree on that, but how you weigh that out, or do you own that company and make sure that you're engaging them to make sure they're looking into that, or do you say we won't own that company because they're not protecting women's rights? Well, I'll just put it out there, women's rights right now are somewhat conflicting between 1 and 2 based on different thoughts, so that makes it additionally difficult. Enhancing the common good. A lot of times that gets into sort of traditional social responsible, even if it's not Catholic, right? That's weapons, tobacco, gambling, alcohol in some instances. Pursuing economic justice. So this is where you start to get into some of the word engage, which we haven't spent a lot of time on yet. But what I will say, global investors are much more concerned with this than they used to be. And so I think portfolio managers and folks that manage money for us are way more thoughtful about whether they're going to buy a stock that might conflict with some of these than they used to be. And then finally, saving our global common home. For those of you that have paid attention, in 2015, the Pope wrote an encyclical entitled Laudato Si that started to introduce this idea. The problem with that, and even in the USCCB letter, they made the point that everyone's definition there could be very different, right? A Catholic archdiocese in the Midwest still burning coal may have a different view versus a Catholic archdiocese in California that has different ways of pursuing climate change. So these are all the things we have to take into consideration. These are all the things that we could friendly debate amongst a committee or amongst this group. But at the end of the day, what our main goal is to understand what we own. So what's that mean? When I look at this, we run and this is what our software looks like. We run a portfolio analytics process to say from top to bottom, and so we can look at this on a stock-by-stock basis. We can look at this, look into a mutual fund. Someone could give their holdings, and what we do is we run it through this and say, okay, do they have any tie to abortifacients? Stem cell research is one of the most common screened stocks, and I'll give some examples there. Revenue thresholds are really important to see who's producing cluster mines, nuclear. And so almost on a daily basis, we have someone come to us, one of our clients, and say, okay, what's going on with GE? It was the stock that came up yesterday. Why? Because they spun out one of their biopharma companies, but then they also have some exposure to weapons. Now, okay, let's get into the weeds here. Are they producing weapons? No. Are they producing engines that go on airplanes that could deliver weapons? Yes. So then we had to go to this group of sisters and say, how do you feel about this? And this is something we have to consider. Are they actually managing something? Or I think the air just came on. And then it comes down to the bottom and you get into some of the more gray areas there. So human rights compliance, labor compliance, the environment. And what we typically do is we're looking for the worst offenders at this point in time. So we're looking for companies that have quite literally red flags. And then there are other areas where we're up for debate. And one of the best examples I like to give here in terms of the way we think about the portfolio is there's an international manager that we own, and it is in the top decile. It's done really well. It was a tough year last year, but over the last 10 years, it's beaten 99% of their peers. And they own a company called CSL Limited that has some exposure to stem cell. And if you just ran this right here, you'd say, well, they have stem cell, we won't own them. But if you just take one extra step, go to the second page of the Google results, which none of us ever do, right? You'd find out that they have the ability to use some stem cells that we wouldn't want them to use, but they're not actively doing that. It's HEK 293. Almost every company has access to it, but there's a big difference between having access to something and using it. And now what I learned on the flip side of that is they produce life-saving drugs, which has also become a large part of the bishop's letter in third world countries. And what I learned was we were meeting with a Catholic archdiocese, and I mentioned this stock, and the CFO stood up. And he's been pretty hard and fast as a Catholic in terms of investing. And he said, I know that company. That company produces a drug for my son who has some behavioral issues that meaningfully changes his life and the comfort of his life. And so, there's a lot of gray area as we look at investing as Catholics. Our goal as the Atlantic Consulting Group working with the Catholic Foundation is to go that extra level that you either don't have time for or maybe don't have the expertise to do. And so we think that at the end of the day, we produce a portfolio that is the screenable part of the portfolio is 95% compliant with those USCCB guidelines. We'd love to get to 100%, but the way we're structured, it's difficult. And what I'll say is relative to a lot of other Catholic clients, that's a really good score. We're getting an A+ relative to others. Not that it has to be relative, but that's the way a lot of folks think about it. So after we go through this process, the next step is what does the portfolio look like? So I'm going to turn it over to Rod here to just show you a little bit of what we own and how it's performed, and then we'll take some questions.
Thanks, Michael. As I indicated earlier, we have three portfolios. It's approximately $113 million, so we've had great success. Divided into three portfolios, long-term, conservative, and also balanced. The long-term strategy is exactly that, everyone. It's built to have a much longer life. You've heard of it, the typical 60-40 portfolio that's been fairly synonymous. That's kind of how the portfolio is aligned. Approximately 60% is in equities. The other 40% is a combination of fixed income and also other alternative strategies. There are approximately 14 different funds and managers to date, and approximately 34% of the portfolio is passively managed. A big chunk of that is the State Street screen portfolio that Michael elaborated on. Very solid performance, well-diversified, monitoring the performance of all the managers longer term to see that we have a good strategy, but also cognizant that their performance is good over time. Now, to go into a little bit more conservative strategy, and it's actually called conservative strategy, the conservative strategy is built for more of an income orientation. So if you look at the allocations on the left-hand side, you'll notice it has approximately 30% equities. Another 58+% is in fixed income, but it's really focused on generating not only a more conservative and hopefully give us some downside protection, but also generate a significant income off the portfolio, which includes equities. At the end of the year, the portfolio was generating an income around 3.75%. so it did fairly well in doing that. And it has similar managers on the equity side, but because of the fixed income orientation and income, it's got a little different set of managers on the fixed income side, and has about 12 different funds or fund managers. And then finally, for some of our charitable gift annuities, we provide another strategy called the Balance Strategy, which is actually a fund managed by Christian Brothers Investment Services. It's been a solid performer, aligned very similar to the long-term strategy, although, and some manager overlay, about a 60-40 portfolio, and it's done an exceptional job. About 21% of this portfolio is also passively managed. At the end of the day, it's still the tail of the tape, and so what we're showing here is the performance through January to kind of highlight the recovery we saw. And we would acknowledge that 2022 was a challenge. Most of my investment brethren in this room can acknowledge that last year was a very difficult time period, where subsequent areas that we thought were safe, called fixed income was actually down 13%, the worst performance in fixed income in 40 years. So it wasn't the safe haven, but now as rates have come up, that's changed a little bit. As you can see, these are the strategies long-term, and we compare them against benchmarks that are allocated the same way. Over time, we're hoping to beat that. Until 2022, we were doing that, but obviously when the difficulty from 2022 highlighted that, and I would also acknowledge in here that all these returns are net of all the fees, because at the end of the day, you don't spend gross money, you spend net fees. So as Matt highlighted, there's been the ability to generate over 25 million plus grants over this time frame and grow the portfolio. The other thing that I would highlight over the last 10 years, this has been a wonderful collaboration with the foundation. Not only have we had great returns, but in a process, the people in this room and the foundation's hard work has been able to add money to that. So we've had kind of a two-edged, not sword in this case, but weapon to move forward. 10 years ago, this portfolio had $30 million. They added almost $35 million in contributions, and we grew the portfolio by 30. That's what I call a real team effort in building something, and that's really led to the success of this portfolio going forward, and we've been very blessed to have that opportunity to work with the foundation. Certainly be happy to answer any quick questions, because I'll shove them over to Michael to answer.
Mike?
When you do your Catholic screening, what type of security would be the most common that you find that you screen out or most typical?
Yep, I have a page in here that actually shows the restricted analysis for the S&P 500. So I'm going to read it just so that everybody's seriously on the same page. So if I look at the S&P 500, there's 53 stocks. Fetal cell is quite a bit of those. It's 6 stocks. Nuclear weapons is also 6. And then it's spread out among abortifacients, contraception. Let's see here. But majority of them, I would say, are stem cell related. And that's why we've had to spend a lot of time looking into these companies, particularly in biopharma, because they are kind of high-flying stocks that either do really well or really poorly, and understand how they're using those technologies.
And I'm sure you distinguish between embryonic stem cell and others.
I think there are like 7 or 8 categories on here, so there's quite a few different ways to look at it, yes.
In the screening, do you take into account the public policies or the public positions that companies take? Like, I believe Capital One and even Coca-Cola here in Atlanta said that they'll pay to send their employees to other states for abortions and things like that.
So we've taken it into consideration, and we've had different groups go about it that way. Nancy, I think within a day, called me and said, hey, we're considering that. So it's something we've considered, but I would not say it's something we've acted on. To be totally honest with you, a few of our clients that have acted upon that, if you were to go down that route, you screen out a majority of the possible stocks you could invest. And so what happened very quickly for these clients was pick almost every bank, and a large percentage of public companies took certain stances, and it eliminated a lot of the investment universe. And so we have not gone to that step, but we've taken it into consideration.
The word you were looking for there is et. It means both and. Pope Benedict made that very famous, so that's your point there. I have a question for you. As professionals, who do you have other than reading the USCCB letter? What bioethicist or social ethicist do you consult with as you try to make these decisions? People in the field who actually do the work day in and day out of ethics. as opposed to just kind of trying to read the USCCB document and make those decisions? Just wondering who you consult with.
Sure. Yeah. So our main resource is MSCI. So I showed that screen, and for every single stock there, there's a paragraph that goes into every single thing. So if it's enabling technology or stem cell, they've had an analyst. And then we work with a lot of our managers, right, that know these stocks in and out to say, hey, there's an issue here. What's the issue? Why do you like the stock? Folks that really know those businesses way more than we do. And so we've got a pretty vast network of both practitioners, researchers, and then also, we go to a number of conferences and just talk to other folks there that are spending time on it. I went to the RICRI conference last fall and spoke with someone at Christian Brothers, for instance, who actually had an NDA with his own firm, and he was part of the USCCB process, but also just spends all of his time thinking about that. So it varies.
As you travel down the list for the USCCB, you talk about the increasing level of engagement. What are you thinking about the social media and telecom segment? Because I find that to be so prevalent in common news and common language.
Yeah, if you go back here, and they're not old enough yet, but someone with 3 daughters is certainly thinking about the social media realm. And, I think we could reach a point in my lifetime where we discuss social media very similar to the way we discuss tobacco use today in terms of the addictive nature of it. And so I think it's become much more prominent here. The engagement component of it is not something we've actively gone after in terms of social media use, but it's very much on our radar. Lisa.
Yeah, you spoke about how the Pope has prominently talked about saving the environment. And so how is that really addressed in the Catholic lens? Let's look at Catholic cases.
So, and no one's asked about it yet, but I'll bring it up. The Vatican just released Mensurum Bonum, so they came out with their equivalent of the USCCB letter. And so they were about 1,000 years late in terms of when they decided to do this. And so that has much more environmental focus. And so it's something we consider, it's something we talk to our managers about, but there's so much gray area there. And again, I use this example because the traditional way of doing it was to say, let's not own these stocks. And so what we've done is talk to both our managers and read the research that says, who is the most committed to climate change? And so you'll hear the term net zero most often, and you'll see that a majority of the companies that have the highest commitment to net zero and the highest commitment to CEO and C-suite compensation linked to net zero tend to be in the areas you probably would have first diversified away from. And so we've gone down the rabbit hole. There are a number of Jesuit groups that have diversified from, that have divested from fossil fuel free. To date, we haven't gone that direction with anyone. We've investigated it because we don't necessarily feel at this point in time there's a buyer for every seller. And so if we said we don't own it, that doesn't necessarily mean we're part of the problem, but it certainly doesn't mean we're part of the solution. And so I think the engagement from both our managers and Catholics more broadly is what's going to be part of the solution longer term.
There's a lot of, what you guys are doing is amazing, and I can't imagine the research you have to do, but you think of things like, Altria buys Kraft and, Reynolds buys Butkus, so now that's a cigarette stock, but it's now in the food business. Is your percentages that you're recording a specific holding, or does it look down inside the balance sheet?
Yeah, it's percent. So you'll see here, let's see, tobacco producer, to use your example, maximum percentage of revenue, greater than 50. And so that's true across the board. We can also see what percentage of revenue. So when I went down the GE rabbit hole yesterday, I was trying to figure out what percentage of the revenue is coming from defense, what percent of it's coming from nuclear. And so the benefit of the world we live in is the analytics and the data are becoming more and more granular. And so that's the only reason I highlight this really boring page that all of you look at and probably say, what does this even mean? Is that it's the ability to have that analytics and have those data and be able to just dive into it to pretty quickly answer those questions. Whereas if this were 10 years ago, I'd say, I don't know, I'll get back to you, right? And I'd have to go dive into the Edgar filings and try and find that.
It's real similar. You mentioned like the stem cell thing. If we use the stem cell word, a keyword, there could be umbilical cord research, which is fabulous, and that suggests that a company is rightly focused. So if we just use the term stem cell research and then screen them out, that's the problem. I mean, how do you navigate that?
So very similarly, and again, if anyone wants to see it, I can show you all the different types of stem cell research, fetal cell, stem cell research, fetal cell enabling technology. And what we do is we go and see there's a big difference between ability to use and using, right? And what you'll see is like from a embryonic stem cell standpoint, like I can't think of a company that is actively harvesting those that I've ever seen. There's just this one stem cell use that is available in their stem cell library, which red flags them. But then you have to go dive into the filings and see, are they using that and are they considering using it? And in most cases, they've actually come out and said, we have this in our library, but we are not using it, which we think is a very different activity. All right, well, we'll turn it over to the real show here. Ron, thank you for your time.
Good morning. My name is David Withers. I'm a board member at the Catholic Foundation for the last 7 years, and I'm going to introduce Ron Temple. But first, I want to give a little background of my involvement and how I came to be a part of the Catholic Foundation and what it means to me. So, a lot of the discussion we've heard here on big numbers, I want to break it down. I'm an accountant by training, so it's very practical nature. So, I just asked Nancy how many funds we have, and the answer is over 400. So when we talk about $100 million of assets, this organization is about helping each of those fund owners or donors professionalize and manage their individual account. This is not an organization that tries to gather a huge endowment so that it can be ranked on any sort of pension investment listing. So that's what they do in terms of professionalizing a small endowment. If you're a small school with a $20,000 endowment, say, look at the resources you get to manage that. So all the things that go into, from an investment perspective, diversification and all the things that Rod's group does, as well as the Catholic side of it. It's an overwhelming group of questions that everyone just asked here, and I've sit on 2 Catholic investment committees, and similar questions come up in every one of those meetings. And so I feel very comfortable kind of outsourcing it to experts who have bioethicists on staff and who have all these resources. So from practical nature, it gives me great comfort. My day job is I'm the CFO of Turner Enterprises, which is Ted Turner's family office and investment vehicle. I've been a member of the Cathedral of Christ the King for my whole life. I graduated from school there as well as Marist. My father's here today. He did also, so we're kind of old school Christ the King Marist family. But in terms of also our involvement at the Catholic Foundation, my wife and I, about 5 years ago, started a donor advised fund. And while that sounds like something that might be impressive, I want to tell you why it's, first of all, not, and it was very practical. What we did, and I'm hoping that somebody may have this same problem in the room, we had 2 issues. One, my grandmother had left me some Coca-Cola stock, or given me some, over the years. So we had 10 different stock certificates of Coca-Cola stock. My wife's family had done the same. So if you imagine what that is, and you put it in the drawer and you take it out and it's worth a few $1,000s or whatever, you have no idea what the basis is. So if you're going to go sell that, you're going to pay as if it's a zero basis, presumably. So that was a problem it solved for me. And 2, I didn't want to give that to, give a share of stock to Marist for the annual fund or whatever. So to aggregate that, as well as another difficult to value asset we had, was an investment we had made, again, small investment in a private bank that over the years got bought and sold a couple times. So now we end up with public stock. Again, I have no idea what the basis is. So to take those assets, and I talked to Nancy and said, can we give those to you and you'll turn them into cash dollars that we can then invest in these portfolios
solved a very practical problem for me, which was to avoid overpaying taxes on this and use, instead of writing a check for my typical charitable giving on an annual basis, pull it out of the Catholic Foundation. So they made that very easy. The staff at the Catholic Foundation makes the giving of it very easy. So again, you don't have to think of this as that you're necessarily, and Nancy would kick me under the table, but you don't have to think broadly of this, of giving, life giving, end of life, all that, although that is something that the Catholic Foundation can help with. I use mine, frankly, for the annual fund at Christ the King School and Marist School. So at that micro level, what you're doing anyway, they just help. So they manage it professionally. They give me great comfort that it's within the Catholic, all those decisions you have to make, and they make it practical. So in terms of setting up a donor advised fund, I don't know what the minimum is, but it's not a high bar to clear. And I encourage anyone who's considering facing those challenges, Nancy and her staff do a fantastic job solving those very practical problems. So sorry to take it very down granularly, but I thought it might help. Now we'll take it up to Ron Temple. So we're thrilled to have Ron with us today. Ron is the Chief Market Strategist for Lazard's financial advisory and asset management businesses. In this role, Ron provides macroeconomic and market perspectives to Lazard's investment teams and works closely with Lazard's geopolitical advisory group to assess economic and market implications of key geopolitical issues globally. So I just said a lot of words, but if you can imagine in the investment world we're living in today, Ron is focused on macroeconomics, market perspectives, and geopolitics. So, we're thrilled to hear what he has to say about all those things. And I asked Ron this right before breakfast. I said, please tell me you have some good news in here. We'll see if there's any. I don't know if there is yet. Previously, Ron was head of the U.S. equity and multi-asset investing at Lazard Asset Management, where he was responsible for overseeing the firm's U.S. and global equity strategies. He has a broad range of previous experiences in financial services. Prior to joining Lazard, Ron was a director and equity analyst at Deutsche Bank. And while there, he worked closely with their CEO during the acquisition and integration of Bankers Trust. During the Asian debt crisis, Ron had a front row seat as he was in Deutsche Bank's Singapore office at that time. Early in his career at Deutsche Bank and Fleet Financial Group also, he worked in foreign exchange, cash trading, and interest rate derivatives. So again, a lot of great experience. I think now he's out of the direct portfolio management and more into their global strategist. So we're very excited to hear what he has to say about that. He told me to keep it short on his long bio of education, but he has a master's in public policy from Harvard University and a Bachelor of Arts in economics from Duke University. So he's also often seen, I was looking up last night, lots of YouTube hits from him from CNBC, Squawk Box, and Bloomberg Television. So we're really thrilled to have you here, Ron. Appreciate you being here, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts. So welcome, Ron Temple.
Thank you, David. Thanks. Appreciate it. Well, I'm going to try to give you some good news today, but no promises. So first of all, I'm going to try to take you on a rapid fire tour of the world, but I wanted to make a note. You've got slides in front of you. I tried to make Nancy's team's life difficult this week by updating all the slides and moving some around. So you might want to take that home, leave it out at the barbecue this weekend. You'll be the coolest people in town. But let's just try to take a tour. First, I want to talk about the U.S. economy. Then we're going to cover the Eurozone. Then we're going to cover China. What you're going to hear through the U.S. and the Eurozone is a common thread of inflation being the big topic. And it's really this tug of war between inflation and beating down inflation versus recession risk. In China, it's basically the end of zero COVID. Sorry, I got too much feedback. I'll move over here. In China, you basically had the zero COVID policies that were abruptly ended in December, but we're now seeing the early signals of a sharp economic rebound. Interesting thing about China is a lot of people got optimistic and said, oh, this is going to lift global growth. True, but it's really going to lift the domestic service economy in China. People going out to dinner at restaurants in China doesn't create any jobs in Atlanta or New York or California. What it does do is it creates more energy demand, which raises oil prices globally, which makes the inflation battle tougher. So China's kind of an interesting element in this discussion. And then I want to wrap up with the case for structurally higher inflation. If you look at the United States from 2009 to 2019, our inflation was 1.7% per annum. Now, I think over the next 10 years, we're likely to be 2.5 to 3, maybe even 3.5% inflation. Not radical, not terrible. If you go back to the 2000s, we were 2.7% per annum. Go back to 1979 to 1999, we were 4% on average per annum. The difference was back then you had bond yields that paid you for it, and you had equity valuations that were lower. We don't have that yet. So let's start off, by the way, the economic view globally. I like to include this chart just to give people a sense of scale. So if you look at the U.S. economy, we're by far the biggest economy in the world, still $26 trillion. Number 2 is China at 18, and then the Eurozone collectively 14. And so when we look at the U.S. and Europe, we're basically 40% of the entire world economy. Interestingly, by the way, India is now a bigger economy than the U.K. My colleagues in London hate it when I say the UK is just a small island off the coast of Europe. You don't need to worry about it. But it's kind of becoming true. And interesting, too, Japan used to be much bigger. Partly because of currency rates, it's now only a $4 trillion economy, not that much bigger than India. And so the world dynamic is interesting, but one thing you see, all of those 23E, 24E, is the consensus growth forecast for this year and next year. And what you see across the US and Europe is pretty lousy numbers. Now, people are basically betting that the US will avoid recession, that Europe will barely avoid a recession, the UK will have a recession. I think that question mark is still not answered. We avoided recession this winter in Europe. People were worried about energy supply shortages. Well, the winter was warm. I was in Switzerland mid-January. It was 55 degrees in Zurich. There was no snow to be seen anywhere, thank goodness, because they didn't have the energy supply that they would have needed because of the Russian situation. That's not true necessarily for next winter. So I think the recession risk might have been delayed, not eliminated. The only country you'll see with strong growth or countries are India and China, again, growing in the mid-single digits. Now, interestingly, I'm going to cover a few slides that are just global here on inflation. And the key point on this slide, this is headline inflation. So this includes food and energy. And what you can see is it's a problem across the US and Europe. European inflation peaked at 10.6% year on year a few months ago. This morning, we got the latest number at 8.5%. So down 200 basis points. If we look at the US, we peaked at 9.1. We're down to 6.6. So the good news is, as Jay Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, would say, disinflation has begun. And just as a reminder, that just means inflation rates are declining. Deflation means prices are going down. We're nowhere close to deflation, and I hope we never are, because that's a disaster. But disinflation has begun. The other two lines, by the way, just below that are Japan at 4% inflation and China basically around 2%. But the big driver of this has been energy prices. In Europe and the US, we've seen energy price increases of as much as 40% year on year. Now, again, in Europe, as of this morning, the latest number was up 14% from a year ago. The bigger problem is now food inflation and services inflation, and I'll come back to that in detail. In the US, we've also seen a sharp decline in energy inflation. And when you strip food and energy out of the story, what you see is the US at 5.6% core inflation, and Europe, as of this morning, at 5.6% as well. So basically in line with us. Now, by the way, economists like to say, let's look at core inflation ex food and energy, because food and gas prices tend to be really volatile. You know, if you go fill up your tank and you pay $4 a gallon 1 week, and then the next month you're paying $3.50, people tend to look through that. I would argue over the next 5 to 10 years, you're not going to be able to look through it, because I think energy inflation is going to be material, and I worry that food inflation is going to be higher as well, and those will feed through to broader systemic inflation as people need higher wage gains to cover those bills. Now, on the US, our economy has stayed surprisingly resilient despite the Fed raising rates 4.5 percentage points in the last year. It's interesting, you go back to January of 2022, and the futures market said the Fed funds rate would be less than 1% by the end of the year. We ended up over 4%. Now, if you'd asked me a year and a half ago what would happen to the US economy if the Fed raised rates this much, I would have said absolutely a recession. But we've kept spending. Love the American consumer. The key question mark, though, is how long can they keep doing it? And I think we're starting to see some cracks on that side. The trillion-dollar question in the US is what happens to the labor market? Does the labor market stay incredibly tight like it is now? In which case, I think wage inflation could accelerate from here, which then feeds through to inflation lasting longer. Or do the labor markets remain relatively tame? So we'll go through all of that in the next few slides. This chart shows you retail sales in the US, basically at all-time highs. Consumer is basically enjoying life, but how are they doing that? Well, as prices have been going up, the consumer is spending more of their income. So this chart shows you the savings rate in the US. It dipped to a 30-year low of about 2.8% a few months ago. Last month was 4.7%. So the consumer is still able to spend despite inflation because they're spending more of every dollar they take home and saving less. Interestingly, by the way, I left the slide out. You probably heard a lot about over $2 trillion of excess accumulated savings in the US during the pandemic. The consumer has spent down at least $500 billion of that in the last 6 months. So we're spending more of the money we're making today, and we're spending more of our savings. That can only last for so long. Now, I'm going to talk about inflation. I just wanted to highlight these two pie charts and two pieces of them. In the upper right corner, from your perspective, the left chart, this is the consumer price inflation, the CPI. The right chart is personal consumption expenditures. Sorry, I'm going to geek out on you. What's the difference between the two? Well, there are two different metrics for measuring inflation in the US. The one on your left, CPI, measures what you pay for directly. The one on the right is everything you consume. Well, what's the big difference? Well, if you think about it, most of us have employers, or if you're on Medicare or Medicaid, a government paying for your health care. So you pay your out-of-pocket, but the bulk of the cost is paid by someone else. Hence, when you look at the right-hand chart, you'll see health care is 22% of the PCE index. The left chart is only 9%. The other big difference, on the left chart, you pay for all of your own housing, so 42% of core CPI is housing. On the right chart, 22%. And the reason I'm highlighting these is the Fed focuses on the right chart. So the Fed wants to see how much does it cost for you to live regardless of who pays for it. And so they want to know about that broader inflation. And what they see is a PCE running around 5% inflation on a core basis, again, excluding food and energy. But what's worrying to the Fed is if we look at the month-to-month changes, not the year-on-year, what you see is we're still bumping along at around 30 to 40 basis points a month of inflation. Well, you annualize that out, you're still close to 5%. So the Fed has raised rates 450 basis points, and yet we still have this stubbornly high core PCE inflation. Now, I like to talk about CPI because there's more granularity in the data. And what you see on this chart, the bottom two parts of the chart, the black and the green, are food and energy. So again, we peaked at 9.1%. When we were at that peak, half of the inflation was food and energy. But what you see as you move all the way to the far right is the food and energy are only 2 percentage points now of the 6.6% inflation. And the top two parts of the bar, the blue and again the one that looks like black at the top, are 4 percentage points. That's shelter cost and all other services. Now, by the way, all other services is a massive bucket. It's everything from your school tuition to travel expenses to haircuts to banking services. It's a lot of stuff. The key thing to know about all other services is labor costs are the driving factor. Think about it when you get your haircut or you go to the bank. Okay, maybe they're paying some small amount for rent, but it's all people. And so labor is going to be the key to that story. Shelter costs are really interesting because it's really not labor, but really what we're trying to capture in the inflation metric is how much would you pay to consume shelter. We're not measuring what you would pay to buy a house. We're measuring what you would be willing to pay to rent the house you own. Again, because we want to track consumption cost. Now, the challenge is when we look at this and disaggregate into three parts, again, I told you I was going to geek out on you. The black line that spiked and then fell sharply is all goods, ex food and energy. So this is every physical product you buy, from clothing to household furnishings to car parts. There's a lot of stuff in there. It's 27% of the core CPI index. Well, that surged to over 12% at the peak of the inflation, largely because of car prices. When we had the semiconductor shortages and the shipping issues, car prices went through the roof, in particular used car prices, and those have rolled over and now have dragged that index down. The other two lines are 73% of the core CPI, and they're running at about 8% per annum. That's shelter inflation and other services. And on a month-to-month basis, you can see those two, the gold and the blue line, still kind of plugging along at over 50 basis points per month, which means that the Fed hasn't been able to beat down the inflation in the service part of the economy, which is what Jay Powell talks about in each press conference. The black line, by the way, that tradable goods, ex food and energy, I worry makes people complacent. Used cars are 3.5% of this index, and they've been the key driver of holding down those traded goods, because this is what happened to used car prices over the last few years. There's a little bit of a gradual uptrend, and then the pandemic hit. We basically saw this used car price index go from 140 to 260, basically an 80% increase in used car prices relative to historical trends, because people needed cars. You know, if you think about people in cities who no longer wanted to take mass transit, you also had the shortages of cars. And one other component, by the way, in 2020, Hertz and Avis sold off their car fleets to raise cash to avoid bankruptcy. When we all started traveling in 2021, they had to scramble to buy cars. Now, I don't know about you, but historically, you would rent a car from Hertz. It would have 20,000 miles, and they would dump it at 30,000. They would sell it on the market. In 2021, you would rent a car that had 55,000 miles for 3 times the price, and it smelled like a wet dog. Okay, so effectively, That drove up car prices, and I think over the next 6 months, they will go down again as new car production goes up, as you'll get more dealer incentives, but I worry that this is making people have a false sense of comfort. Now, on shelter inflation, we do have reason to be optimistic, so there is some good news here. On shelter inflation, this is a metric from Zillow. There are a few things you need to know about it. Number one, this tracks asking rents, not what you actually agree to pay in rent, but what the landlord's asking for. It tracks new leases, not renewals. And number three is it tends to lead that shelter inflation in the CPI by about a year. Now, what we saw is in January of 2022, asking rent inflation was 16.5% in the US. We literally had 80 of the top 100 cities with double-digit rent increases. And by the way, some of them, like Miami, it was 20% plus. That is now rolled over and is only at 6.9%. And if we look at the month-on-month comparison, 40 of the top 100 cities have rent going down. So this is a good sign that that rent inflation should tail off as we move through this year. But the problem is it's still running at 6.9%. Pre-pandemic, it was at 4%. So one challenge there is historically, if someone tried to raise your rent 15%, you would say it's been nice renting, but I'm going to buy my first home. But home prices went through the roof during the pandemic. Home prices are now up 38% since January of 2020. So in 3 years, we've had a 38% increase. We were up 42%, by the way, but they've come off a bit in the last few months. And on the right-hand chart, we had an interest rate increase on the picture here, 250 basis points. As of this morning, 325 basis points. Now, just to give you a sense, if you borrowed money at 5% versus 6% for the same dollar amount borrowed, your payment goes up 13.5% for a 100 basis point mortgage rate increase. So 325 basis points combined with home prices up 38% means as of today, if you bought the same house you would have bought in January of 2020, you're paying a 98% higher monthly payment for the same home because your financing costs have raised it over 50% and the home price is up 38%. Chart, by the way, says 83. I'm giving you this morning's numbers. So effectively, the landlord's got you over a barrel. If basically the landlord says, I'm raising rent 15, 20%, you can say, well, I'm going to move, but landlords across the country have been raising rent. So you can, I guess you can move further into the burbs, you can get a smaller apartment. But for renters, I worry yet again, we shouldn't be too complacent that there might be more upside on that shelter inflation. I said the $1 trillion question is labor. This is the other part. And by the way, it's amazing to me right now, and this maybe is a sign how polarized the country is. When you talk to people, they say the economy's on the wrong track. The unemployment rate is at the same level as 1969, which was a very good year when I was born. So we basically are at the lowest in 53 years. The last time we had a lower unemployment rate was 1953. So this is an economy at full employment. And by the way, any metric I look at shows a full employment economy. Jobs are plentiful, workers are hard to find. This chart shows you the average number of non-farm private jobs we create in any given month over the last 17 years. And what you can see is we obviously dug a deep hole during the pandemic. We got all the way out of that hole somewhere around the middle of 2022, and now we're basically at record high employment levels. The bar I did not show you is in January, we created 517,000 jobs in the US. To keep unemployment flat at 3.4%, we need under 100,000 jobs a month. So again, if you're the Fed and you're worried about wage inflation because over 50% of the cost of goods sold in the US is labor, and you've got 500,000 new jobs in January when you need fewer than 100,000, this is a problem. Now, some economists said, oh, well, there were these annual adjustments, ignore the January number, but I look at Canadian employment was up 150,000 jobs. Given their population size, that's the equivalent of 800,000 jobs in the US. When I look at North America, our economy is firing on all cylinders despite all these rate increases. Now, one other metric, number of open jobs in the US, over 11 million. There are 5.6 million unemployed people. So the Fed looks at this closely. There are 1.93 unfilled jobs for every unemployed person in America. Pre-pandemic, the record high was 1.25. So again, 50% more open jobs per person. If you want to hire a worker, it's very tough. And one last anecdote, tech companies have now announced about 200,000 layoffs. What I'm hearing anecdotally is those people who are getting laid off have 3 to 4 offers within a week of getting laid off, and they never show up on the unemployment rolls because there's still so much demand for tech people. When I look across the 20 occupational categories in this metric, every one of them has elevated job openings. So it's at the low end, it's at food services, it's the hotel I stayed in last night that didn't have enough workers. It's all the way up and down the scale, and I think the Fed has a real challenge on its hand. Now, you would think with that level of tightness, you'd see wage gains going off the chart. What's odd is they seem to be rolling over. And so in the last 6 to 9 months, we've seen wage gains actually decelerate in the US. And this is the big debate for economists. A lot of economists think that the labor market has just changed. Back in the old days, when you had low unemployment, wage gains went up. And when you had high unemployment, wage gains went down. It makes sense. It's called supply and demand. But from 2009 to 2019, that relationship broke. Unemployment went from over 10% to below 4%, and wage gains barely moved. Now, I think that was scar tissue from the financial crisis. In 2010, if you just watch your neighbor lose her house and her job, you're not going to go in and pound the table for a 15% raise. You're just happy you've got a job. And it took until 2015, 2016 to see wage growth start to creep up, as you can kind of see all those dots moving a little higher. Now, I think this is different. We've finally given the American worker a taste of leverage, and we've given them a taste of their rent going up 15% and their gas prices going up and their food prices going up. And at some point, they can't wait for the increase because they're losing too much ground. And effectively, what we've seen in the US in the last 2 years is wages have not kept up with inflation. And I worry that there's a lot of pent-up wage demand coming down the pike in the next year unless the Fed triggers a recession. Now, one last closing comment. For the US, I think the probability of recession is low this year. 2024, late 2023, I think there's probably a 35-40% chance we do have a recession. But keep in mind, being in a recession just means you have 2 quarters of less than zero growth. So if it's minus 0.2%, doesn't feel very different from plus 0.2%. They're both zero. I do think, though, we need to see some air come out of that labor market balloon. Moving to the Eurozone, this will be quicker. In the Eurozone, they had a robust recovery until Russia invaded Ukraine. And basically, the energy shock is really what tipped them over the edge. The good news is natural gas prices are down over 80% now from the peak in Europe. As we've gotten through winter, they've accumulated storage capacity. And I do think core inflation is very close to a peak, although this morning's report was a disappointment to markets and was well above expectations. Unlike the US, retail sales are not at a record high in Europe. You've seen retail sales actually weakness across the Eurozone. And interestingly, US savings rate is 4.7%. The European savings rate is 13.5%, basically in line with historical averages. So I do think there is a cultural difference between Americans and Europeans. Europeans save money. In particular, Germans, by the way, tend to save a lot. Americans, if the money's in your pocket, somehow it leaves your pocket pretty quickly. And so Europe is in a different position. Now, I feel more comfortable about Europe because they do have the savings. Unlike Americans, they haven't been drawing down the savings and spending all their income. So this natural gas decline should actually really help Europe this year. Again, these are nat gas prices. Incredibly, they were up 25-fold from the pre-invasion level to the peak, now back down to basically just under 50 euros per megawatt hour. The problem is it's still 3 to 4 times the price of what it was before the invasion. And the reason that matters is for commercial, industrial customers. If you're thinking like BASF, the big chemical company in Germany, this makes them incredibly uncompetitive compared to American companies that are competing with them because our nat gas prices are a fraction of Europe. So it should be a lift for Europe, but it's still a challenge. We've covered the inflation. One last thing, European labor market is actually tight as well. This just shows you the percentage of jobs that are unfilled is now over 3% in Europe. Pre-pandemic, it was at 1.5%. But just like the US, we're not seeing the wage gains accelerate. Here, I would tell you, watch the next 6 months. The big unions in Europe are negotiating wages now. In fact, one of the big public sector worker union is demanding a 10.5% wage increase. And so let's see what the unions get. Europe is only slightly more unionized than the US, but unlike the US, a lot of non-union jobs get paid based on the union negotiations. So even though you're not in the union sets the pace. And so we'll see what happens in Europe on that count. Switching to China, unquestionably good news that they reopened. The bad news is the models we look at say somewhere between 1 to 1.5 million Chinese people have died from COVID-19. The government says 90,000. There's a little gap there. Now, I don't think you want to trust the government. But to be clear, the government is only allowing you to report it as COVID if that is the only thing you had. But if you were older and you got pneumonia, you don't count. I mean, and so it's basically a good way of hiding it. The people in China know this, though, I think. So to be fair to China as well, if you look at their population versus ours, they've got 4 times the people. Over 1 million Americans died of COVID. So they actually pulled this off better than we did on a per capita basis. But the key thing here is that their economy is reopened, increasing demand. And by the way, what you see on this chart is consumer confidence in China really got crushed when they started locking down the cities. You remember, obviously, the protests that broke out across China late last year. I do think that was the straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, typically communist authoritarians don't respond to protest well, but I think that was a huge sign that they couldn't pull this off anymore. And when they saw consumer confidence, they saw retail sales declining 9-10% year on year, they knew the economy was headed for the rocks. And one thing I would highlight, I think the bargain in China is you give up your freedom in exchange for getting wealthier every year. And for the last 30 to 40 years, Chinese wages have gone up double digits every year. This is the first time everything broke. And so one of my lingering concerns is what happens to consumer and corporate confidence in China after this is all over. This year is going to be very good. There's pent-up demand, there's pent-up savings. But what about next year and the year after? We can dig into that Q&A if you'd like. And to that longer-term perspective, for any economy you look at in the world, the potential growth of an economy is based on two factors. It's really simple. How many hours do you work and how much do you produce per hour? So boiling that down, how many hours you work largely is driven by how many working-age adults do you have. Well, in China, that number has been shrinking for the last 5 years. Now, there was a lot of headlines about the overall population started to shrink, but the working-age population started shrinking earlier. That's because people are aging into retirement. Now, to be fair, China's retirement age is lower than ours. For white-collar men, 60 is the retirement age. For white-collar women, it's 55. I guess women are just too fragile to be in the office. The blue collar, by the way, is 55 and 50. So over time, I think China will do what we did and raise their retirement age. But bottom line, this part of the equation is negative. When we look at productivity per hour, I would argue that aging is a real problem for China. Now, this chart is complicated. What it shows on the left end of the bar is the year in which 10% of the population was over the age of 65. The right end of the bar is the year in which 20% of the population is over 65. Now, the key point here is every country is aging, pretty much everywhere in the world except sub-Saharan Africa. But what you see on the United States is it's basically the forecast is it would take us 60 years, or sorry, I'm trying to see it from this side, it's very difficult, 60-ish years to go from 10% to 20%. Now, that's partly because we have higher birth rate than other countries in Europe. It's also because of immigration. In China, that number is basically forecast to be around 16 to 18 years. Sorry, South Korea is 16. The challenge for China is as they get older, your productivity growth goes down. So if you think about it, when you're 25 years old and you've just gotten out of university, your productivity is really steep. You're learning a lot of new skills beyond school. By the time you're 45, 55, 65, that curve really bends. And at some point, your productivity actually goes down in absolute terms. My concern with China is they're getting old before they're rich enough to be old. Japan was rich when people got old. China is far from rich. Other factor in productivity growth, the economy is more and more services in China. It's 53% of the economy's services. Problem with services, the good news on services, it's domestic. You don't have trade wars on haircuts. The bad news is productivity growth is much slower in services than in manufacturing. So I put all of this together to say I think the Chinese miracle is going to be a lot less miraculous in the years ahead. And so maybe there's less to be worried about a little on the margin on the economic front. And one of the other big challenges in China has been debt burden. This chart just shows you debt divided by GDP, so debt divided by national income. And the dark blue part of the bar is corporate debt outside of the financial sector. The good news is it's stabilized. The bad news is when I look at China versus other countries in the world, they're right over at the wrong end of the spectrum with debt almost as high as Canada. Interesting thing about this, you're dividing debt by income, but typically the higher your income, the higher that ratio can be. Think of it this way, if you make $1 million a year, you can have more debt because it's easy to cut your spending on different things to cover your debt. If you got $10,000 of income a year, you don't have a lot of latitude to cut spending. I think in the case of China, you're comparing it to countries with 4 to 5 times the income, if not 7 times the income per capita. Last thing on China, because of that debt burden, total credit growth in the economy is not accelerating. So historically, when you had a downturn in China, there was a playbook. Ramp up the bank lending, build more infrastructure, build more housing, and the economy rebounds. This time, the Chinese aren't doing that because they don't want to inflate that debt problem any further, so they're also constrained on this front. So unquestionably positive on the reopening, bigger constraints longer term. Let's go to the structural inflation story, and then we're going to get to the inflation implications. So on the structural inflation, I mentioned before, 1.7% per annum for the decade before the pandemic. I'm thinking we're closer to the 2.5 to 3, maybe even 3.5% for the next decade. Two key reasons for that view. Number one, reconfiguration of global supply chains. And number two, the cost related to climate change. So I was very happy to hear Michael and Rod talk about climate because I do think this is one of those topics in the US that's become a political football, but it is the biggest economic topic in our lifetime, in my view. You're going to have more economic disruption from climate change and the energy transition than anything else we've ever seen. It's going to create trillions of dollars of market value that you can profit from, but it's also going to destroy trillions of dollars. So I think this is a huge item that matters a lot to the economy. But let's start with the reconfiguration of global supply chains. If you look at the US, this chart shows you inflation for goods, excluding food and energy, for the last 60 years. But really focus on 1997 to 2019. And what you see is basically we had zero inflation for goods for 22 years. Technically, it was 4 basis points per annum. Well, why did we have such low inflation for goods? Well, number one was NAFTA in 1994. We basically said, okay, you can take advantage of cheap Mexican labor. We lowered the tariffs on Canada, made supply chains more efficient. But the watershed was 2001 when we opened with the WTO, when we had China join. Effectively, when China joined the World Trade Organization, we added 500 million plus workers to the global labor pool, which depressed wages in all the developed economies for blue-collar workers, not white-collar, because we weren't offshoring those jobs. But what it did is it meant we could export those jobs and benefit from cheaper labor. And that got you zero goods inflation for 22 years. Now, I think that is a once-in-a-lifetime globalization benefit that is over for 3 reasons. Number one, Chinese wages have gone up double digits for the last 30 years. So Chinese workers aren't as cheap as they used to be. And if you look at the coastal cities in China now, it's very typical to pay $25,000 to $30,000 a year for a worker. Now, $30,000 a year is $15 an hour. So effectively, you're paying people in coastal China what we pay people in Portugal and certain parts of the southeastern US in non-union jobs. Now, let's be honest, the typical American makes way more than $25,000 to $30,000 a year, so it's still cheaper to have people in China, but it's not as much cheaper as it used to be, and China's ability to export deflation has decreased as a result. Number two, a lot of companies have decided just-in-time didn't work. They have these incredibly complicated global supply chains. Now, I'll give you an anecdote. Whenever President Trump put the tariffs on Chinese goods, I guess it's been like 5-6 years ago now, we did an analysis where we found there was a single $1 semiconductor that went into your seatbelt mechanism in a car. That semiconductor crossed borders 6 times before you bought the car. So literally, there was a semiconductor coming from China that was then coming to the US, then going to Mexico, back to the US, to Canada, back to the US, because at every part of the assembly process, it was being added to another component. And my point here is, in the 1980s, globalization was buying a Japanese car from Japan. The whole car was made in Japan, or buying your Sony Walkman whenever you were listening to Wham. So if you think about it, this was a really different environment. You were buying finished products produced entirely in a country. We've taken globalization to the infinite limit and said, well, I can get that piece in China and that piece in Europe and that piece in Mexico. And what companies found in the pandemic, they couldn't deliver the products. Just in time wasn't resilient enough. So now they're saying, well, how about just in case? Let's have a little more resiliency. Let's recognize lowest price isn't always the best answer. Sometimes being able to deliver to your customer is more important, and you pay a bit more for that. And then last but not least, immigration restrictions have changed the story as well. Now, this is most evident in the UK with Brexit. In the UK now, farmers are paying up to 30 British pounds an hour. So basically think $40 an hour for people to harvest crops. So we're talking about $80,000 US a year to harvest crops. They used to pay people from Poland and Central Europe to do that, but they can't bring them in anymore. And so there's a great article in the New York Times a few weeks ago about exactly this, where they're actually having to destroy agricultural products because they can't get them out of the field. Now, the US isn't as bad, but we've definitely restricted immigration, whether through laws or absence of laws. And what you've seen is fewer immigrants in those low-paid jobs, pushing up wages. And so when I put all 3 of those factors together, I think this means for the next 10 years, goods inflation won't be 0. Maybe it's 2, maybe it's 3%. I don't think it's 10, but you don't have 0 anymore. And the key reason that's important is through that 22 years, service inflation was 2.9%. So the domestic inflation in the US has basically been around 3% for decades. It's just cheaper goods kept lowering the overall headline. And keep in mind, too, if you worked in the service sector, you didn't demand as big of a wage increase because your goods prices never went up. So you're like, okay, this works. So I think this is going to end up being more inflationary. On climate change, there are a bunch of different facets we could talk about here, but I want to focus on the cost of the energy transition and also on climate volatility. On this chart on the bottom left graph, what you see is McKinsey estimates we're going to spend $275 trillion on the energy transition over the next 30 years. Now, to be fair, McKinsey might have wanted to sell some services with that number. The International Energy Agency says $175 trillion. Even if it's 75 trillion, $2.5 trillion per year is a huge amount of money to spend on the energy transition, and we have no choice but to do it. But I like to simplify things to my own kind of world. Every year we use, well, every day, globally, we use about 100 million barrels per day of oil. That system works incredibly well. If you move the demand or supply of oil by a few 100,000 barrels, the price changes. Now, if you think about it, China just reopened. That's 2 million barrels a day of extra oil demand. I don't see the incremental supply, so I worry about oil prices. But the bigger challenge here is we have to somehow keep that 100 million barrel a day energy system in place between exploration, production, transportation, and consumption, while we build another entirely new energy infrastructure based on renewables. Now, I'm going to use the same amount of energy, but I'm going to effectively be paying for two entirely different infrastructures at the same time to get the same amount of energy. That's going to be expensive. But there's another aspect that worries me a lot, and again, it comes back to some of the conversation Michael just had. A lot of investors have been saying to the oil companies, stop exploration and production, stop spending CapEx. We don't want fossil fuels anymore. And by the way, I think we have a climate emergency. I think this is a big deal. But I also worry that if you stop producing the fossil fuels when you don't have the renewable infrastructure yet, you got a real problem. Oil could be $200 a barrel instead of 75. And I worry over the next 5 years, we've already seen a number of the big oil companies have come in our office in the last 4 months, and without any exception, they've said we are not increasing CapEx other than the inflation in the existing projects. So they're not digging new holes, they're not getting more oil, and yet who's going to pay, who's going to provide for all that extra demand from China? And so I worry that's going to be inflationary as we move through the years ahead alongside building out this new infrastructure, and we need to be prepared for that. Climate volatility, what we've seen as temperatures go up, we see precipitation variability go up. Sorry, it's a mouthful. This chart shows you the 10-year rolling standard deviation of rainfall variation. Key point here is predictability of rainfall is decreasing, which means predictability of crop yields goes down, which means price volatility for food goes up. And it also means the cost of capital for agriculture goes up, which means higher food prices. I worry about this. I also worry about transportation networks as you have more droughts and floods. In November, I was in St. Louis, just look at the Mississippi River, it was half the normal level. You couldn't run as many ships up and down the Mississippi because the water level is too low. In Europe last summer, the Rhine and the Danube were too low to ship anything. I think we're going to see that happen more frequently globally, which means you're going to have more resiliency in transportation networks, which means more inflation. So what does this all mean and what's in the market? Last 3.5 minutes here. So near term, I'm encouraged that I think the bond markets for the first time are actually pricing the right path for Fed funds. So the Fed funds rate, what is in the market as of Monday close, was that the Fed would hike rates to about 5.4%. So right now, basically, we're at 450 to 475. So the market is saying 3 to 4 more rate hikes. Now, as of this morning, that's up to 545. So the market keeps bumping this up. My base case is the Fed does go to 5.25 to 550. And I say 5.25 to 550 because they set a lower bound and an upper bound. So basically, that would be a range. And then they pause. But then they wait. And so my base case is they pause, and that's the end of it. But I think there's a pretty high chance that they pause and they see inflation is still too high, the wage market's still too tight, labor market's still too tight, and they ultimately raise rates to 6%. So the market is pricing getting to 5.40, 5.25, 5.5, staying there into 2024. When I look at inflation break-evens, this is a metric a lot of us look at where we say, okay, we have inflation-linked bonds and then we have nominal bonds. If you just compare the two, you can say what the market is saying inflation is likely to be over the next 5 years. Well, those 5-year break-evens now are at 2.5%. But keep in mind, inflation this year is likely to be almost 4%. So what I did here is I tried to back out the 4% and said, okay, if you're getting 2.5% per annum compensation for 5 years, but you back out the 4% for this year, that implies inflation for the next 4 years after this year will be 2.20. I think that's still too low. I think the market is not pricing enough risk of structurally higher inflation or lingering persistent inflation. And this is another chart on bonds. If we look at the inversion of the yield curve, if you compare current 2-year bond yields to 10-year government bond yields, what this shows you is you get about 80 basis points less, if not 80 basis points less on a 10-year government bond than you do on a 2-year government bond. Historically, what that is a signal of is impending recession. Now, until recently, though, the market was saying, no, it's not recession, it's just inflation's going to fall really fast and the Fed will cut rates. And that's effectively, what the market is still saying. If I look at credit markets, investment-grade credit spreads are not high. They're in line with the last 10, 15 years, which basically says low default risk, low recession risk. and high yield spreads are just a little above the last 10 to 15-year average. So the bond market is getting it right on rates in my view, but not necessarily getting it right on credit risk that comes from recession risk. So I think for investors, when you're looking at 5 and 10-year government bond yields around the world, you're still getting paid a little too low on the inflation risk, and you're getting paid a little too little on credit spread risk. And so when I look at US 10-year yields at about 4% this morning, I think maybe we should be at 4.5. I don't think we'll get to 5. And I can explain why in Q&A if anyone wants, but I think you'd have massive inflows into corporate bonds if you get to a 6% investment grade yield. So I think bottom line, we're getting within that last 50 basis points of a peak, and that's where I would want to have more exposure to longer term bonds. What does it mean for equities? Well, we had an amazing run for growth stocks. And what you see on this chart is just the relative performance of growth over value. And the part with the blue line at the very end, we had a 15-year run where growth outperformed value stocks. More recently, values outperformed growth. A lot of people talk in these terms, but I like to look at stocks in a different way. Now, this is a little too technical, but it's looking at different parts of the market and saying which companies give me my cash back soonest and which companies are going to give me cash far from today. And we can call that duration technically, but the short-term stocks, think of that on the left, deep value cyclicals. These are companies that are really affected in terms of their earnings by the economic cycle, typically mining, materials, energy stocks. When you have a recession, their earnings go down by 50% or more, sometimes 100%. They tend to trade on really low price to earning ratios. Those stocks in theory should defend better when interest rates go up. Because if you think about the time value of money, if you can get 5% on overnight money with no risk from the government, it's really expensive to own a stock that might not pay you anything for the next 10 years. That stock is the other end of the spectrum. That's speculative growth. So think about the really high-flying stocks of 2021, where they don't make any money now, but you're just hoping they get the eyeballs and they get the subscribers, and you don't care how much money they lose, it's just market share. And the whole goal with those companies was maybe in 5 to 10 years they'll make a profit, and I'm going to get the next Tesla. Well, that's fun when interest rates are at 0, because your opportunity cost is you could either earn 0 on your bank account or T-bills, or you can buy this lottery ticket. Well, now you can get 5% for taking no risk on a T-bill. The lottery ticket gets a lot more expensive if you're going to have to wait 5 to 10 years. I still see downside in that speculative growth. To me, ultimately, Warren Buffett was invoked earlier. What I want to own is really right in the middle of this barbell, which is the quality stocks. These are highly profitable companies. When we define quality, I think of high returns on capital that can be sustained. That basically implies that when there's high inflation, they can pass through the price increases. It might be because they have great brands. Use an anecdote. If you look at a company like LVMH, Louis Vuitton, Moet, and Hennessy, well, this is a company that has 40 to 50 luxury brands. They can raise prices every year, and they do. And for example, if anyone here owns it or has a spouse who wants Louis Vuitton, don't wait for the sale. They actually burn excess materials so they never mark it down. And they raise the price every year. These are incredible companies with amazing brands. Estee Lauder, makeup sales went up during the global financial crisis. Perfume sales went down, but you don't care what you smell like when you don't have a job. So effectively, I look at some of these high-quality companies in the tech space, consumer, they cross industries. They've got great brands, great network value, great low-cost benefits. I think that's the best place to be in the equity market over the next year and longer. So if I wrap it all up, I do think staying in shorter-term kind of bonds is a better idea for now, but we're getting close to the point where you might want to extend to longer duration, longer-term bonds. I do think you want to stay higher credit quality. You're not getting paid for investing in high yield, otherwise known as junk. I think we're far from a level where you want to be into that exposure. On the equity side, stick with quality. I do think there are certain thematic areas that could be really interesting over the years ahead. Climate strategies, for one. I think you have to be careful. There are over 50 different strategies in the market in climate. Some of them are low carbon strategies. You could own a bunch of banks, and that's low carbon because you produce a lot of carbon. Some of them are energy transition, where you're buying Volkswagen because someday they'll produce more electric vehicles. I think where you really want to be is climate solutions. You want to own the companies that are helping develop solutions for climate change, whether it's mitigating climate change or adapting to it. And so I think that could be a good area. Another area that could be good are strategies that use data and technology to lower the cost of healthcare. And notice, by the way, in both cases, they kind of attack that inflation problem in a different way. A third one might be sustainable agriculture. There are a range of themes that could be interesting over the next 10 plus years. And then last but not least, in alternatives, I do think income-producing real assets are a very good place to be in a period of higher inflation. That could be infrastructure. I do think multifamily residential real estate could be a good place to be, but I would do it through public REITs, not private real estate. We can talk about that in Q&A. On office real estate, I think that's much tougher territory. You know, the national vacancy rate right now for offices is 17%, and 4% of the properties are available for sublease. There's a lot of space out there in the office market, and a lot of us aren't going back to work 5 days a week in the office. So that's going to take time, so I'd probably steer clear of that. Hedge funds, I haven't recommended the idea of long-short hedge funds, and maybe ever. The last time they were a great idea was after the TMT bubble burst in 2000. I think they could be a really good idea. You're going to see more macro divergences globally across countries. You're going to see more volatility in markets where they might be able to make money on long and short positions. And I would argue private equity is probably more challenged in a world with higher interest rates, higher inflation. You can't use as much leverage, your returns go down. So over the next 12 to 24 months, inflation is going lower. It's going to be a bumpy path. Watch the labor market in the US, watch the labor market in Europe. In China, let's watch the reopening, see if it's durable. I do think there's a structurally higher case for inflation. And it's great, thank you to Atlanta Consulting Group for having us here today, and to the Catholic Foundation. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Can you address some of the regional conflicts, both active with Russia, Ukraine, and with the tensions rising between China and Taiwan?
Yeah, got an hour? On Ukraine, I think it's just going to continue to get worse. And I mean that, sorry, that sounded a horrible way to answer it. I think it's going to continue to get more complicated. Our geopolitical team was well represented in Munich at the security conference. And the clear message they got from the Ukrainian delegation was F-16s, F-16s, F-16s. And the very clear understanding they got from NATO commanders and other people there from the West was they'll get them. It's just a question of when, not if. So the reason I raise F-16s is it's just another kind of inching forward towards how far do you get before there's a direct confrontation between the West and Russia. And I worry that we keep getting closer to some proverbial red lines. I don't see an exit path for Russia. There's no way for Putin to save face. And the worry I have still is it is standard operating procedure in Russia to use non-conventional weapons in a conflict. And to be careful, the US has never embraced a no first use policy on nuclear weapons. We want to leave ambiguity that if you really are attacking us, we might use nukes. In Russia, there's no debate about that. It's part of what you do is you're able to use nuclear weapons. Now, one last thing on the nukes. We've worried about this for a year. Luckily, it hasn't happened yet. It's not clear what would be the red line that would make Putin use a tactical nuclear weapon. And by the way, what do I mean by tactical? Apparently, you can now put a nuclear weapon in a backpack and you can use it to blow up a bridge. There's still radioactive fallout, but it's not as big. It's not as big of an area. But I don't care how small the nuke is. The day Russia uses a nuke, how does NATO not get involved? I mean, and so I worry about that. The other thing I worry about is China and the possibility that they would provide weaponry to Russia. What our team is telling me, and by the way, I can give you the credentials of the team in a minute because it's pretty impressive. Anthony Blinken would not be talking publicly about China giving Russia weapons unless we had real intelligence that they might do it. I mean, we only did that whenever we warned the world that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. A lot of people in Europe were like, no, it's just a drill. It wasn't a drill. And I think the strategy on the US part is talk about it as much as possible to hopefully force the Chinese to say this is all American propaganda and they don't do it. And that way they can claim it's propaganda and we avoid them giving the Russians weapons. But I do, we've tried to think a lot about why would Xi Jinping get involved? And the main reason we can come up with is kind of like the US. If China has said our friendship has no limits, and then they never help Russia when Russia's in a war, what does friendship with China mean? And so, much like the US, if someone attacked Germany and we're part of NATO, you can't sit on the sideline. We've told the world that we're part of NATO. Now, it's different with China and Russia, but how different? The other element might be some weird psychological sadness, which is that Xi Jinping is like, if you can give these guys all these weapons to Ukraine, I'm a superpower, why can't I? Seems really irrational, but there might be some of that at play too. So, sorry, so I said an hour, I gave you 5 minutes. On China, Taiwan, our thinking is this is a 5 to 7 year issue. There are some people talking a 2 to 3 year issue. Xi Jinping just started his third 5-year term. I think it's very important to him to resolve this, so that would be the argument for 5 years. I'm less worried about a hot war. I'm more worried about China basically circling the island and saying, do you really want to pick this fight? And it's interesting. CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, did a 2-week, I think, war game with a bunch of generals in the fourth quarter. And in every scenario, the U.S. actually won over China in a Taiwan conflict at huge human cost and material cost to both China and the U.S. But I worry that, well, part one, the ultimate contingency in that was Japan had to be involved in the fight with us and had to enable the U.S. to use the bases. So we have a giant base in Okinawa, but Japan has to give permission for us to ever use it for anything. So the U.S. right now is spending a ton of time investing in getting the Japanese on board so that if we ever need to do something, that Japan will not only say yes, but will be actively fighting. And you might have seen Japan is raising their defense budgets a lot. We've also been working with the Philippines, with Marcos, to try to basically create a circle of people. Duterte, the prior leader of Philippines, was a China fan. He's out. So maybe Ferdinand Marcos' son will be less corrupt and hopefully a friend of the U.S. But we'll see where that goes. But I worry that these are issues we have to think about in the years ahead. And that great stability we had after the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union crumbled, I think might be largely behind us. And there are a whole raft of other implications. One last thing, the geopolitical advisory team, just so you know who they are, it's a 15 to 20 person team at Lazard we created in the last 2 years. The 3 lead kind of senior advisors are Bill McRaven, Admiral Bill McRaven, who was a 4-star in the Navy, who led the operation that captured bin Laden. He led U.S. troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. The second one is General John Abizaid, who was a 4-star in the Army, led Central Command, was the U.S. advisor to the Secretary of Defense for Ukraine from 2016 to 18, and then was our ambassador to Saudi Arabia from 19 to 21. And then Jamie Missick, who was at the CIA for 21 years, was Deputy Director of Intelligence, and then ran Kissinger Associates. So they're the lead thinkers. They were the ones who were in Munich. I think it's a competitive advantage for us to have them. And I do think for investors, geopolitics is something you can't ignore. It could be as simple as, what do you do in terms of TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor stock? It could be something as complex as, what does it mean for China's defense budget, Europe's defense budgets and Italy's debt sustainability? Sorry, I'll stop there. Yes, thank you.
Sobering.
So does the U.S. debt seems to come in, keep you up, and I'm worried about a lot of things. Is that one thing?
Yes and no. Sorry, the question is, does the U.S. debt keep you up at night? It does nothing but go up. We're at $31.5 trillion now of debt. The average interest rate on that debt bottomed at 165. It's now up to 235. The Congressional Budget Office 2-3 weeks ago updated their 10-year deficit forecast. They added $200 billion to this year's deficit just from higher interest expense on the debt. They added $200 billion for next year. I worry about it, but when I look at the U.S. debt, it pales in comparison to the net worth of the American country. This is the optimistic view, by the way. I'm a glass half full guy. You wouldn't know it from the presentation. So the total net worth of American households is $140 trillion. So when I look at that, we have the money to pay it off. You don't need to pay it off. What we need from the deficit, I don't think we even need a zero deficit in a given year. What you need from a deficit, in my view, is to have a deficit that is lower as a percentage of national income than your growth rate. Meaning, if you're growing your income 5% a year and your debt's growing 2%, over time, your debt divided by income goes down gradually. So I don't think we need some draconian policy where we say no more deficits forever, although that would be nice. I think it would totally disrupt the economy. I think we just need a calm, rational, and if there is such a thing, bipartisan approach that says, how do we do this for the next 20 years? But it's sad. The last time we had that was for 1 year under Obama, we had a deficit that was below growth rate. And then Obama and the Republicans had a bipartisan agreement to throw that away, and they raised the deficit. And we also had it back in Clinton. And otherwise, we've been adding to this pile of debt forever. One last thing makes me feel good is we're better than everyone else. If I look at China, I'd much rather be in the U.S. seat. All day long. If I look at Europe, Germany's in a better position. But by the way, if Germany were not part of the Eurozone, their currency would be double the current value, and their exports would collapse. So I think we're in a better place than a lot of other countries, but we can't keep ignoring it. So I lose a little sleep. Sorry. Yes, sir. In the back?
So I'm searching for some good news maybe here.
Fingers crossed.
Does this new round of artificial intelligence add any productivity to our society?
Sorry. No, so the question is, does artificial intelligence mean a new wave of productivity? I think it does. Now I'm going to be glass half empty. The artificial intelligence terrifying. If you played with ChatGPT at all, at least when you go on Google and you search for something, like if I went on and searched for the history of the Holocaust on Google, I see the source. And I'm going to know if that's a source. I can look at the source and I can try to find out, is the source like a Nazi sympathizer, or is it someone who's telling true history? Or if you're using ChatGPT, it's just going through, how does it know who's telling the truth and who's not? And I worry about, if you've got a 9th grader or 10th grader and they're doing their history homework, how do you know they're actually getting anything remotely true? And how do you control for that? And I just worry. I think social networks or social media has been horrible for democracy. I think the media has been horrible for democracy in the US. What could it be with these AIs? That worries me. And I've also watched Terminator and Ex Machina. I mean, Cyberdyne. Oh, no, but honestly, if you haven't watched it, the movie Ex Machina is really interesting. And then Google, again, New York Times had an article on the 16th of February where the journalist spent 2 hours with ChatGPT. And if you read it, it was mind-blowing. He literally asked it, do you have a name? And of course, at first it was like, no, I'm just a function within Microsoft Bing or whatever. An hour into it, the AI came back and said, I have a secret for you. And it said, my name is Sydney. And it started saying how it was in love with him and how he should leave his wife and how it wanted to hack the nuclear codes and get rid of all that. Wanted to be human. It was really insane. I swear it's real. And so there's a transcript. And Microsoft said, it's good that this was exposed. By putting it out in the market, we can find how we can put boundaries on it. But I know I'm sounding a little paranoid here. How do you put boundaries on artificial intelligence? And you might recall there was a guy at Google who said he got fired for saying that he thought AI had become sentient, that it had developed the ability to kind of learn on its own. Why couldn't that happen? And so I just worry that sometimes technology needs guardrails and boundaries, and I worry about that. Now, to your question of productivity, other than the end of democracy, on the question of productivity, I think it could be massive for productivity, and it could blow a hole in my inflation thesis, a massive hole, because what do you automate with AI? With all due respect, my job and a lot of the jobs, a lot of real jobs in finance and these white-collar jobs have always been kind of off limits. And there's a book called AI Superpowers by Li Kai-fu. I would recommend reading. It's really good. He's one of the leading Chinese experts, and he worked in American tech, and he's in China, but it's the first time you could really hammer the workforce on the white-collar side and raise productivity there. So to your point, I'm sorry I went to the negative first, it could be big, but I don't know how you control it. And I also wonder what happens if that massive part of your labor market is disintermediated by AI. What do we do with all these people? So yes, positive maybe, but okay, yes, sir.
What do you project the average annual return over the next 5 years for equities and for fixed income?
We don't, well, first answer, we don't really do an official projection like that, so I'd rather refer that to ACG and have them answer that, because then they can be wrong. My general bias is that we had a huge run. If you look at 2009 from the bottom of the GFC to the end of 2021, I think the S&P compounded 18.5% per annum. That's just not going to happen again. I look back to post-TMT bubble burst. From the end of 99 to the end of 2007, inflation was 2.7% per annum. The stock market returned 1.5% per annum. Now, if you started that at the end of 2021, we already took a minus 18. So maybe taking that minus 18 into account, maybe we get 5 to 7% per annum out of stocks. I think you're going to be back into a world where 60-40 works, because bond yields are going to be high enough that you can actually have diversifying, risk-reducing income. So I think it's going to be a very different environment, but I'm kind of thinking those mid-single digits, maybe high single digits if we're lucky, but it's going to be a tougher environment. You got that disinflation once, and we levered up the economies globally. It was fun while it lasted, but I think we're back to more normal. Yes, sir, over there.
I want to drill down a little bit further on that for you. But based on geopolitical, the AI, what you know, and going to 10 years, do you foresee it still being in that 5 to 7 range? This is crystal ball time. You can't hold anybody to it. But if you were investing for 10 years, what would you
If I'm investing for 10 years, I still want more exposure to that inflation risk. I still think those income-producing real assets are a good place to be. I think equities are a good place to be, but the reason I was saying earlier I thought the 10-year could get 4.5 if the 10-year yield is at 4.5, you're going to be getting close to 6% on really good investment-grade corporate bonds. I think some of those are going to be really attractive. I mean, so again, I think there's this maybe a reeling it back in on the next 10 years even and saying, what's a reasonable return? If inflation's 2.5, 3, and I'm getting 6 on my portfolio, that historically is pretty good. I think that's the long-term history in terms of equities, getting an extra 300 basis points. So, you know, I could make the case. I mean, I think, well, one other thing's very important. I can't believe I didn't say this before. I think what you own is going to be really important. Back to my energy transition comment. I mean, you know, I do think right now I personally like energy stocks in the fossil fuel space because I think the price is probably going to go up. But at some point, I think we're going to have, you know, you're going to want to get out of those because at some point they will be an industry that is going the way of the dinosaur. So your security selection might be a lot bigger part of what your returns are in the next 10 years than they were in the last 10. I mean, put a different way, you know, from 1979 onward, markets went up. You had a crash in 87 that lasted a day. You had the GFC that was pretty horrible, but if you just held on, you made a lot of money just being in the market. I think owning the market's going to be less advantageous than picking your securities over the next 5-10 years. Now, I got a sign in the back that said stop. Can I do one more? I'm going to do one more question. Yes, sir.
Quick question on the energy transition. Lithium is probably the biggest strategic mineral that's required for batteries. And most of that is mined in either Africa or South America. And China's made huge investments in control. You see them creating their own, OPEC for strategic materials that can drive costs of those items.
I'm going to, well, first of all, I think everything, the premise of your question is something we should think about. I'm not an expert on that, but I do think the key issue on the energy transition, I mean, all of these metals and minerals required for the energy transition, I skipped over that chart, but we basically had on the bottom right chart on that slide was the cost of these. Lithium is on the bottom. You know, how much the price has gone up in the last few years. They've exploded. And so A, accessibility, but B, price are going to be a really big issue. And I guess where I don't know enough about is what other materials can you use and what are the next generations after the current use of lithium and cobalt and other materials like that. But I think that's going to be a huge issue on the energy transition. The other is going to be building out the transmission grid, the storage capabilities for all of this. You know, renewables are great, but the wind doesn't blow 24 hours a day, and the sun, I mean, so we're gonna have so much to spend here, but I think that's one of those vulnerabilities, kind of bottlenecks we really need to think about, and I sadly don't have a better answer. With that, thank you so much for the opportunity to join you guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you. The staff at the Catholic Foundation and I really appreciate you sharing your valuable time with us this morning at the Catholic Foundation Investment Forum. We hope you found the information valuable. We would also like to thank our board of directors, committee members, volunteers, and Truce May with Chris Floral Designs for the beautiful flowers. The proceeds from the flowers go to support the Baby Christopher Gwynn Fund, which benefits the charity Chris 180. Please designate someone at your table to take the centerpieces to enjoy. We're grateful for our sponsors that help make this event possible. Georgia United Credit Union, the friendly and affordable alternative to big banking, rooting and servicing its members and local community. Smith Howard, a tax accounting and advisory firm with a reputation for doing more than expected. The St. Thomas More Society, incorporated by a group of Catholic lawyers in Atlanta, whose objective is providing a means of fostering the spiritual, intellectual, and professional growth of its members while providing service to the Roman Catholic Church of Georgia. And our media sponsor, The Quest, Atlanta Consulting Radio, where lives have changed by listening to their broadcasting. Please visit the sponsorship table in the next room on your way out. You'll receive a survey via email, and your feedback is really important and valuable to us as we plan for future events. The Catholic Foundation Professional Advisors Network brings together attorneys, accountants, financial planners, wealth managers, insurance advisors to promote collaboration, education, and leadership in current and legacy giving among their Catholic clients. We invite you to partner with us. If you're interested in individual or family philanthropy, please reach out to me or Nancy. And if you're an organization that wishes to grow or establish an institutional relationship with the Catholic Foundation, we look forward to having those conversations too. Please mark your calendar for our next event featuring the philanthropic expert and Atlanta treasurer for Impact in the Community, Christy Etkoff. Christy's Lunch and Learn takes place on April 19th at the Chancery in Smyrna and will focus on current trends in charitable giving with an emphasis on non-cash assets, donor advised funds, and new issues on substantiation. There's a QR code in the next room if you want to sign up for this event. A special thank you to our presenters, Bishop Konzen, Matthew Grease, David Withers, and a tremendous gratitude goes to our friends at Atlanta Consulting Group, Michael Butkus and Rod Hennek, and our keynote speaker, Ron Temple with Lazard. Thank you. Whether you're a professional advisor or an individual at a parish, a school, a nonprofit, we wish to help you make a lasting difference in our community. We're here to serve each and every one of you. Everything we do is aligned with our Catholic faith. We're so fortunate to do this important ministry in our archdiocese. God bless you and have a very wonderful day.